So thanks very much for joining me. My name is Rob Hawker. I've been working with Fabric now for around 5 years, but my career as a whole, just very quickly, I started my career as a chartered accountant. So I joined PwC out of university and spent a few years training and got qualified, but never really got me out of bed in the morning. It was something that I could do rather than something that I love to do. And I found my way into data and analytics, working for Vodafone for 10 years, looking after the data governance and data management side of things. So master data management, data quality, and general appointment of data stewards and data owners and all of those good things. I continued that for a little longer before becoming head of data and analytics and managing a team at a large flu vaccine company, and kind of establishing data and analytics for that organization. And there I found Power BI for the first time and just fell in love with it and started working with it, and almost neglecting my management responsibilities because I got so hooked on playing around and working with Power BI. And I never really looked back from that point on. So I changed the focus of my career to go down the data visualization route and continue with Power BI. And obviously, as Fabric has come, I've grown into that space as well. So here I am now, 5 years on, working as an independent consultant, doing training and consulting with my company, Maloro Limited. And I'm here to talk to you guys today about my experiences with Fabric Capacity Management. So I will share my screen and we'll make a start. Fabric Capacity Management. A Fabric Capacity is like a performance car. You know, we buy from Microsoft a significant amount of compute capacity, and it can really handle a lot. Even some of the smaller sizes can do incredible things. But if we don't manage it properly, we end up with the capacity stuck in the mud and not delivering what we need it to. So today it's all about how we avoid getting stuck in the mud. So in today's session, we're going to go over the basics of what capacities are, and how we manage them. We're going to go over the impacts of poor capacity management. So what can go wrong? We're going to spend a lot of time on how we mitigate those capacity issues. And then we're going to go through a quick real life example where an organization I worked with had multiple capacities. So the basics, what are capacities and what can go wrong? So a fabric capacity is basically just a certain amount of CPU, memory, storage that is dedicated to your organization. We pay Microsoft a certain amount of money per month to have a capacity, and any workspace in Fabric that we put onto that capacity will have both Fabric capabilities, meaning that you can create things like lake houses, warehouses, notebooks, and use the One Lake Data Explorer. And it will also have Power BI premium features that we may have been used to pre-Fabric. So things like deployment pipelines, larger models, being able to build data flows on top of each other and use the XMLA endpoint. So if you buy a capacity and you put your workspace on that capacity, you get all of these things available to you. So, and if you have an F64 or above capacity, what used to be a P1 capacity in the Power BI premium world, you don't need any licenses for your end consumers. They will be able to use a Power BI free license to consume any content that they want to consume. So that's the basics of what the capacities actually are. And in terms of the licensing costs from Microsoft, this gives you a rough idea. So we have the very small F2 capacity all the way down to the F 2048 capacity, talking an absolutely enormous amount of compute power down here, the F 2048 capacity. The largest I've ever worked with is an F256. So this is a really huge, enormous amount down here at the bottom, and the costs are equally enormous. So you can be very flexible with your prices. You can pause these capacities if you want to, if you're on the pay-as-you-go option here. So for example, as a very small consultancy, I have my own F2 capacity right now, and I will just pause it out of hours to make sure that I'm not incurring this cost when I don't need to. You can also reserve the capacity for 1 year plus, for a 40% saving, but for that you can't then pause anymore. So that's broadly what the yeah, that's broadly what a capacity is. So Srini Vasan, we will get to exactly that question. Don't worry. I won't try and answer it now because we have plenty of content on that later. So what can go wrong with capacities? So two things really. One, you can spend too much money, right? So you can buy yourself an F64 when you only need an F32. So you're spending more money than you need to. Or secondly, your capacity can be too small or it can be poorly managed. And I do put those things side by side because a lot of the time people end up buying more capacity than they really need for the workloads that they have, just because they're not managing it and staying on top of it. And you're just spending money on the capacity when you could be spending money on other things just because you're not putting the right management in place. So that's what we're going to get into today to allow you to have your capacity as small as possible and get the most out of it. So if your capacity is too small, you can end up with things like unpredictable cost because you're having to scale up now and again when you get caught out. You can end up with a poor end user experience because they have this thing called throttling, which means that end users might start getting error messages. And then finally, you have this high maintenance effort potentially where you're constantly battling with the capacity and managing it all the time. So we'll dive into these things in a bit more detail. So let's just go through these things. What is throttling, first of all? So throttling is the Microsoft term for Microsoft clawing back some capacity from you when you've overused your capacity. If you go over 100%, basically, they'll start to do things to you. And we'll go into what each of these things are in much more detail in the next few slides. Autoscale is basically when you put a setting in place so that if you run out of capacity, Microsoft will automatically add capacity for you, and there'll be a cost involved in that. And then what I meant by hyper management is where you're kind of constantly moving content around. So maybe you've got your Power BI Pro shared capacity, and you've got your Power BI Premium capacity, and you keep moving things from one to the other. And maybe you're giving a colleague in finance the capacity today and then you're giving it to sales tomorrow, and that's the only way you can stay within your 100% boundaries, and that obviously takes a lot of time for you as a Power BI/Fabric admin. And I put too small always in quotes really because, again, as I say, people often say their capacity is too small, but actually it might be the right size if you put some good practices in. And later on in this presentation, we're going to go into what those best practices are and how they can help. But that's just a quick precursor to what we'll talk about later. So don't necessarily assume your capacity is too small. It could be that the content is not being well delivered at the moment. So let's get into throttling in a little more detail. Does anyone have any questions at this stage? I'm keeping an eye on the chat. Okay, let's go into what interactive delay is. It's not a disaster. Users are trying to open reports. They don't even really know that they're being delayed. It's just they click the report and it takes at least 20 seconds longer than it would have done previously. Now, interactive rejection is where we're getting into danger territory. This is where we actually receive error messages for our end users. So when they click on a report to open it, the report literally won't open. They'll receive this error message. And this is where you get your senior stakeholders. Maybe they're trying to look at their headcount. Maybe they're trying to look at the sales figures, and they'll be reaching out to the CIO and saying what's going on with Power BI, and Sev1 tickets and things like that get raised. This is where we're into danger territory. And then the final and most worrying stage is where you've already got that interactive rejection, but the issue is so bad that you're now having all your background jobs failing as well. So your refresh histories will start to show the following error message. So showing that you've exceeded your limits and all your refreshes start to fail as well. So this is where you really need to be reactive and dealing with these problems. So that's what those three things mean. And what triggers it? So it's a lot of people struggle to understand this area because it is a little bit opaque and time consuming. So I have a couple of examples here, which I hope will bring it to life for you. So throttling happens when you've used more capacity than you've paid for, basically. So the complexities around this are these concepts from Microsoft called bursting and smoothing. So bursting is where Microsoft allows us to get the performance of a higher capacity for a short period of time, as long as we are paying back that extra capacity quickly enough. So maybe my F2 capacity for my small consultancy, maybe it will behave like an F32 capacity, but if I keep asking it to behave like that for an extended period of time, I'm borrowing too much future capacity, and I will start to actually get throttling as a result. Microsoft will force me to pay it back with throttling. So bursting is a good thing for us. It gives us great performance in Power BI/Fabric. But if we overuse that great performance, then that's when we start to get throttling. So bursting is basically borrowing future capacity. And then the other side of this smoothing, this is the way that Microsoft handles that from a capacity point of view. So it basically says, look, that activity may have only taken 30 seconds, but we will smooth that over 5 minutes. So the capacity is actually taken over 5 minutes to pay for the extra burst that you were given at that point in time. And the background activities like refreshes, for example, can actually be smoothed over a full 24-hour period. So what that means is that sometimes if you're really heavily overusing your capacity, especially in background activities, that overuse can go on over a 24-hour period and continue to cause you problems over a whole 24-hour period. And I've got an example of that later on. So here's a very basic and simple table to show you what I mean. So time number 1 here, we've paid for 10 units of capacity, but what we're doing is heavy lifting, and it's actually a requirement for 30 units of capacity. So we've used our 10 and we've actually borrowed 10 more and 10 more for the next 2 capacity times as well. And actually in this case, we've borrowed 100% of our future capacity in times number 2 and times number 3. So that's where we're potentially getting into throttling. And you can only borrow 100% capacity for a certain limited amount of time until Microsoft will come and ask you to pay it back. So the next slide, I think, will hopefully show that again and a little bit more clearly. So this is exactly the same example, but just in a nice visualized format for you. So at T1, we've got our requirement for 30. We've used the entire black square up to our paid capacity limit here, and we've borrowed the whole of T2's time and the whole of T3's time. So the units are then borrowed from that future capacity. We're borrowing 100% of the capacity in T2 and T3. And if the time between T1 and T3 is 10 minutes or more, we are going to get some kind of throttling, either interactive delay or worse. So let's bring that to life a little bit. So here we go. So if that's less than 10 minutes, the time between T1 and T3, we get no throttling at all. If the time is between 10 and 60 minutes, we get interactive delay. So what I mean by that is if we've used up all of our capacity for the next 60 minutes by what's happening here at T1, then we immediately get some interactive delay. If that time is between 60 minutes and 24 hours, then we get interactive rejection, which is, a nasty scenario for us to be in. And if it's more than 24 hours, that's when we get this serious background rejection situation. So that's a relatively tricky concept. So I will just pause there to see if there's any questions popping up. If anyone wants to ask anything now before I move on, please do. No, okay. All right, so here's a real example for you. So one of my customers, there was a complex data flow running, and it ran on a Saturday morning when no one was really monitoring the capacity, and an issue occurred. It's actually an issue on the Microsoft side, because what had happened is on the Microsoft side, the infrastructure that's supposed to process the data flow had gone down, and rather than it getting moved to another part of their infrastructure, it just sat and queued. But for the capacity, but the telemetry was telling our capacity that it was running at full throttle basically. So it wasn't really an issue for the customer itself. It was more of an issue on the Microsoft side. But still, from a capacity perspective, it consumed the entire 100% of the available capacity for 17 hours. But because of smoothing, it the job was running for 17 hours, and then it was smoothed across the following 24 hours. And by the time people came in on Monday morning, the 210,000% of the paid for capacity had been built up as an overage or a debt. And that had led to background rejection, the worst situation as described here. And the interactive rejection didn't actually stop until the following Tuesday, despite taking all the mitigation that we possibly could. The CEO got directly affected, and obviously there was a lot of pressure to sort it out. And we made many changes after that, and I learned quite a bit myself from that situation that I'm now sharing with you guys today. But this is a real example. Don't be like me. Do better. Um, so mitigating then these capacity issues, what can we do? There's a whole heap of things that we can do, and we're going to go through them together now. So the first and most simple thing that you can do is just set up notifications on your capacity. And I've just jumped to my browser just to show you where you would go and do that. So you just go into your admin portal, assuming you are the Fabric admin. If you're not, then obviously you have to ask your Fabric admin to do this. You go into capacity settings. You can actually be a capacity admin without being a Fabric admin. So some of you may find that if you go into settings and admin portal, you may still get these capacity settings here, because you're the admin of just the capacity itself. And then what you can do is just come in here, click on the capacity name, go to notifications, tick this to say you'd like to get a notification at a certain percent. I recommend 60%. When you get to 60% of your available capacity being used, and then another notification when you've exceeded all the available capacity and might get throttling. And by default, that goes to capacity admins. But if you want to, you could change that to be other contacts in the organization if that's better for you. So that's the first and most simple thing, get those notifications to your inbox and be prepared to do something about those. And then the next thing I would say is that we must install and use the standard Microsoft Fabric Capacity Metrics app. And again, I'll just show you how to get that if you don't have it already. So you just go into the apps section over here in Fabric, and you've got Get Apps on the top right-hand corner. But actually, before we do that, we need to know something. So I'm just going to quickly show you something we need to find out. So we go back to our capacity settings again. And this time, I'm just going to go to my Fabric capacity. And you see up here in the URL, we get this GUID, this sequence of numbers and letters. That's actually my capacity ID up there. And you'll be able to get your capacity ID this way as long as you're a capacity admin. So just get that ID, copy it, paste it somewhere else, because you're going to need it when you get the app. So we go back to this screen, apps, we go to Get Apps, we find the Fabric Capacity Metrics app. There we go. And we just click Get It Now on this next screen that's about to appear. And then once we've done this, it's gonna bring the Capacity Metrics app into our environment, and when it's going to ask us to provide the capacity ID. So for me, because I've got it already, it's obviously asking me to update the app rather than install another copy. I'm not going to go ahead and install another copy for now. But this is the process that you would use, and you just simply need to paste that capacity ID that I showed you, so this thing up here, into the app when it tells you to do it. So that's how you get the app itself. And then what we're going to do now is just go through what that app looks like, and how you might use it to look after your capacity. I'm just taking a quick look in the chat. There's more in there than I realized. Sorry. So Jamil, yes, you can choose not to allow auto scaling. and throttling then will automatically happen. Auto scaling, I will come back to later on, but I tend to use it on a very critical capacity that's got all the critical use cases on it for the organization. Kevin, I'm just reading your response to Jamil. Yeah, absolutely right. What are the units being used here? So I'm not sure if your name is Brooks or Jessup. Sorry, I'm probably getting confused there. But 10 versus 30, that's just my simple example. I mean, basically, what we're talking about here are Microsoft's consumption units. So when you buy a capacity, you get a certain number of consumption units per second from that capacity. And then you'll see in the charts I'm about to show you that you're able to then compare how much of each artifact in Power BI/Fabric is being used at a certain point in time, and see therefore what percent of the capacity it's taking up. So don't worry about my units. It was just a very simple example to try to introduce the concepts. Stefan, I'm not sure I quite understand the question. Is it the time of overusage or the expected payback period? The time of overusage is what triggers throttling. If that's more than 10 minutes, that's when you get into throttling. Kevin, absolutely right. Yeah, interesting question, Brooks. Why not make it a native function of Fabric rather than downloading an app? I mean, once you've downloaded the app, it's not too inconvenient. It's there and you can use it whenever you want. Okay, Kevin, you're being very helpful. Thank you. How do you create alerts from the Capacity Metrics app? You don't create them from the Capacity Metrics app. You just create them from the space that I showed you earlier on. So let me go back to the presentation and make sure I stay on track. So one thing I would say about the Capacity Metrics app is do make sure that you are careful which workspace you put it in. If you put it in a workspace which is on the premium capacity, on the Fabric capacity, and that capacity gets throttled, you actually won't be able to open the Capacity Metrics report. And we got caught out by that, one of my customers. So we had to move it then to shared workspace. So move it to license mode Pro to avoid the risk of it actually the report itself being throttled. There's kind of an irony there that the report itself can get throttled. So if I just show you quickly, here's my Fabric Capacity Metrics workspace, and obviously I have it under license info here. It's on Pro now. So if you put that on the capacity, on the Fabric capacity, and the capacity is throttled, you won't be able to open the report anymore, and then you can't even diagnose why the capacity is throttled. So important tip. Okay, so let's just take a quick look at the report itself. Now, I'm not showing you a live demo of that because I'm working in an environment where it's just me, and my metrics are thoroughly boring and not worth showing you. So this I'm showing you here is in a much more interesting tenant. And so the first place that I look when I come into this report is this top right graph up here, and I'm looking for peaks where these reds or blues have gone over this line here, and at that point I'm getting worried. If they're getting close to that line or over that line, I'm getting worried about having throttling. Now the red lines are users interactions, so running reports, etc., and the blue are background operations like refreshes. And you can see the background stuff is very smooth, very much kind of, you don't get those big peaks, whereas with end users you can see the working hours coming in and out, where people are actually online. So coming back to some of the questions in the chat, Microsoft give you these consumption units representing amounts of computing power basically, and an F64 capacity, you get 64 consumption units for every second. So in a day you've got 5.5 million consumption units, and you can start to then get an idea of what's going on. Because if we look at this data flow here, it's taking over 14 days, it's taking 2.3 million consumption units out of our capacity. So 2.3 million if you think you've got maybe a couple of hundred data flows, that's quite a big number, and you do want to start thinking about how that could perhaps be reduced. So yeah, hopefully that's starting to give you an idea of how this fits together. So let's just talk about how we actually use this report. So I use it in two ways. I use it reactively, where an alert has come to my inbox where we've gone over 60%. And then I will immediately come and open the report and try and find out what artifacts are causing that peak. So I'll spot the peak. This kind of peak that we're seeing here, where we're quite close to the 100, that's something I would definitely be worried about. I would be drilling through to that time point there, and I'd be looking at which artifacts are causing that problem and taking immediate action on that. But I would also do some proactive review of this report. So I open it on a regular frequency, and I start to look at the artifacts that have got high consumption unit use. So that the data flow I mentioned with 2.3 million CUs, that's too high, really. I want to discuss that with the owners and see if we can do something to improve it. So let's cover both of those things. We're going to spend most of our time on the reactive stuff. So here's an example. We've got our peak here of 90%. It's interactive activity. So it's either going to be report views or it's going to be XMLA endpoint activity. So that's where somebody's connecting using Excel or DAX Studio or Tabular Editor or something like that. And they're running a heavy activity on a semantic model. And I would then drill through to the detail page for that time point. So you just simply right click on that chart there on the particular point, and it will allow you to drill through to the detail page. So when you drill through, this is what you see. So you have an interactive operations section, as you can see from the title there, and then you get a background operations section, which we'll see in a minute. This particular peak is due to an XMLA endpoint read. So you can see it says XMLA endpoint read there. And you can see which user, although obviously I've obfuscated this for this meeting, but you can see the user's name, the item name, which workspace it's in, and in this case, it's taking nearly 50% of the capacity in just one single artifact. And no surprise then that we're up at nearly 90% of utilization. So in that case, I'd be trying to find out what that user is doing and asking them to be really careful and avoid doing it again. So, the process, I'd contact the owner, I'd understand their activity. And the key thing here is ask them to find a better way. I see some people just writing to the person doing this and saying stop and then moving on. But actually, our job as capacity admins is to find out what the user was trying to do and try and help them find a better way of doing it. So potentially, using other Fabric options would help here. So using a notebook. So maybe this data could be landed in a lakehouse in Fabric, and we could use a notebook to create a file format that they can use for whatever they're trying to do. And then they can use the OneLake Data Explorer on their computer to just download that file. And it would be much more efficient from a CU perspective and not cause that kind of horrible peak. DAX Studio is very good at downloading things into files in an efficient way. But if they're downloading the data because they don't like the visualizations that the report developers given them, we'd help, they should be helped to redesign the report. I think the key thing is here, don't just say no and then expect them to find a solution to their own problem. It's usually better to help them to a solution so that they don't keep doing the same thing over and over again. Okay, so then going on to background operations. So this is exactly the same page that we're on before, and we now have the background operations to look at. And in this case, what I wanted you to observe is that the background operations are smooth, as I said, over 24 hours. So you can see this one here. It says scheduled day set refresh. No, sorry, that's not the example I thought it was. We move on. So let me start this page again. So the actions we take would be very similar if it's background operations. So if the blue lines are actually going over the 100% line, we'd still take very similar actions. We would drill through to the next page. We would spot those background peaks. But what you can find is the actions that we need to take can be quite different for those background peaks because they can run over this 24-hour period. And they can, whereas the interactive operations tend to be quite quickly. So if with a background operation, if it is still running and causing problems, you'd find out first of all if it's still running. You would consider whether to stop it straight away if it's burning huge amounts of capacity, and then you would work with the owner to understand what's going on in that refresh that's making it so expensive. Because background operations are typically very low in the amount of capacity that they take up. You would then start the refresh again, but this time you'd monitor it really closely and make sure that it's not going to be causing the problem again. Now, where you do run into difficulty, as in my real life example from earlier, is where the refresh has already finished and it's being smoothed over that kind of 24-hour period potentially, and it's staying at 100% or beyond 100% for a really long period of time. That's when things can become very problematic. So I have a checklist based approach for this. So I typically will write a checklist a bit like the one you see on the right over here, where you kind of make it really clear to people what happens if you go into this report and you find it over 100%. What happens what if you see it between 80 and 99, and what happens if you see it between 60 and 79, and the actions kind of decrease in their severity, if you like. If you're over 100%, you are in crisis mode. You're trying to avoid interactive and background rejection, so you're immediately reducing consumption, and your all options are open at this stage. So we'll cover what some of those options are in a minute, but we can cancel refreshes. We could even remove access for end users to really problematic content if we need to. Whereas, in the 60 to 79% mark, it's a bit more judgment. I'm looking at if we're down at the early 60s and I can see that something peaked very briefly and then disappeared again, I may not even take any action if I'm having a busy day and I don't have the time. Whereas if we're up at the sort of 75% mark and that's happened, then yes, I'm definitely going to take action to avoid getting to the crisis mode. So I recommend creating a checklist because, not every person is in every day, right? So what you need is a group of people that are all behaving in the same way when these things are happening, and you're following a fairly systematic approach, and making it really clear to people what they should do. Not everyone's going to be an expert in this. So these checklists tend to show, exactly what button to press in the app, exactly what to do to contact the owner, to speak to that owner, remove access if needed, etc. So I recommend writing a document like this. Let me just check on the chat and see how the questions are going. So, Jamil, is a PySpark notebook executing on a scheduler considered background or interactive? That would be a background activity. All notebook activity is background, as far as I'm aware. Kevin, thank you. You're answering all the questions. Okay, so then just coming to another aspect of the app then. So where the 100% consumption unit level has been exceeded and throttling has started, you'll see an overage that needs to be repaid. So in the detailed time point page that we've been covering already, you'll see this table down here where you've got add percent, burn down percent, cumulative percent. If you've got anything in that cumulative column at all, you have got an overage, and it needs to be paid back. If you're seeing cumulative has a number in it and add is has got numbers in it as well, the problem is actually getting worse. And if you're seeing cumulative with burn down with a percent in it, the problem is getting better. So this is basically, if you've got anything in the add column, it's saying we're still over 100, and this is how much got added in this time point. If you've got something in the burn down column, it's saying that we're below 100% and we're now using the capacity to pay back the debt. This is where I saw my horrible 210,000% at one point, and it gives you an estimate of the minutes to burn down. I would not say that that is reliable though. If that's the minutes to burn down, if nothing else is going on in the capacity at the time, and you can't trust that. So don't go to your management team and say, oh, this says it's going to be 60 minutes until things are back to normal. If it says 60 minutes, in my experience, it's probably about 100 minutes. So just bear that in mind. So the overage is also visible over here as well in this main page. So you can see this says throttling and overages over here. So if you just go to the other versions of this chart, it will actually show you graphically this cumulative percent and overages as well. So there's a couple of places you can see if you're over. So then if the overall utilization's dropped then to below 100%, then we'll start to pay off and we'll see that burn down number. But if sometimes the utilization gets stuck over 100%, if you've got something really severe going on, like my nasty data flow that I talked about earlier, and it continues to worsen over a really long period, sometimes then you have to take some pretty drastic action. So you could go through and stop all the future scheduled refreshes, but that can be quite nasty and time consuming because obviously you need to then go back and reschedule them again afterwards. So one action that I've seen taken before is actually turning off the on-premises data gateway. So if a lot of your refreshes go through a gateway, just by turning off the gateway, all the refreshes will automatically fail without you actually descheduling them. And then when you turn it back on again, they will all work again on the next time that they're scheduled. So it is a drastic option, but it is something that can be quite useful to know. And if you wanted to do that, just to show you how, you can just go into the settings again, manage connections and gateways, click on the gateway, and then click on the I button here. And then over here on the right hand side, you have this simple toggle, enable or disable. So you can just disable it and all the refreshes then will naturally fail. And that can help you avoid and create further capacity that can be used to pay off the debt. The other thing, if you have more than one capacity, you can start transferring capacity from one to the other. So let's say you've got one F128 and 164 capacity. You could actually move half of the capacity from the F128 over to the F64, and that can potentially get the broken capacity, if you like, back up and running a little bit faster. The other thing you could do is turn on Autoscale for the period that you're struggling with, and it will automatically add capacity for you, or you could pay temporarily to change the size of your capacity. So obviously costs then increase, but sometimes the situation can be so bad that you do need to do something a bit more drastic. So just trying to give you all the options here. So then just the next couple of slides just show how to do some of those things. So if I was back in the capacity settings screen, this is how you change the size of the capacity. You would actually have to, let's say you have an F128 as this one is here, you'd have to go into change size, reduce it down to F64 first, and then only then could you allocate the 64 spare units to the other capacity. This is showing Power BI Premium. If you were doing this for Fabric Capacities, you do it through the Azure portal rather than here in the Power BI world. Okay, so Autoscale, I've mentioned already. So turning Autoscale on can be really useful for the situations where maybe something happens in the middle of the night and no one's around. Then the Autoscale can get turned on automatically without you being there. But at the moment, Autoscale is only available for the premium SKUs. So what I mean by that is the former Power BI Premium. So if you signed up to if you signed up before Fabric existed to Power BI Premium capacity, then you definitely have Autoscale. But if you've only bought a Fabric capacity, then there is no Autoscale capability at the moment. I'm not sure whether that's on the roadmap or not. I couldn't find it on the Microsoft roadmap for Fabric, and I'm waiting to try and find out whether it's on there or not, or will be on there in the future. But Autoscale can be very handy, as I say, if you want to make sure that things can't go wrong. And actually, at one of my customers, we have one non-critical capacity and one critical capacity. And on the non-critical capacity, we leave Autoscale off to have certain costs. And on the critical one that we know the very senior stakeholders use, we have Autoscale on to make it really resilient. So, it can be a really good thing to have in your armory. In terms of proactive management, so we talked about what you do reactively. In terms of proactive management, what you should be doing, as I say, is opening up the report on a regular basis, working through the top items in that last 14 days artifact list, and trying to understand which of them genuinely need to be burning the highest CU in the whole organization. So maybe it's a semantic model with 14 million rows of data and it has to have 14 million rows of data and there's nothing you can do about it. Fine. It earned its place in that list. Maybe it's something that has just been built in a not very helpful way and could be improved, and therefore you could work on it a bit and get it off that list and make your capacity a little bit freer. The other thing you can do is look at the top content from a usage perspective. So if you go use the Fabric API to get the activity logs and the catalog data, which, showing all your workspaces and your reports and semantic models, etc. If you can find the content where the usage trends are really positive, i.e., it's doubling in usage every week, and if you can correlate that to your CU usage, then you can take action before they become an issue. So I'll give you an example. So we had a new report released at one of my customers that was showing was not on this high at all on this list of 14-day consumption unit, but it grew 400% in a few weeks, and as it grew it went right to the top of that chart, and we could have seen that much earlier. We could have seen the likelihood that that was going to happen, and we could have reacted a lot quicker than we did. So this Power BI Monitor app, if you search for Rui Romano Power BI Monitor GitHub, you'll find a kind of fully pre-built solution that you can just use in your organization to monitor activity and catalog data. It's a little old now and Rui doesn't really maintain it anymore, but it's a really good place to start if you've never done any activity log and catalog work before. Okay, so the next thing from a proactive point of view, I would urge you guys to introduce, if you don't already have it in your organization, quality control processes. So a way of reviewing content that people are building on a regular basis to check that it is using best practices from a performance point of view. So, if you're reviewing a model and you're seeing many-to-many relationships, those tend to be a risk from a performance point of view. We all know that DAX, if it's not done very particularly well, or if the model's bad and the DAX has to be highly complex, that we can run into performance constraints pretty quickly, iterator functions and things like that. If the model doesn't have a star schema, it's just like one big table, like a large query with, say, a couple of hundred columns. There's a bunch of text data in there, so I saw a model very recently in a review that had only a couple of tables in it, but one of those tables was 7 million rows and 246 columns. And 7 million rows doesn't have to be a problem, but if you combine that with 246 columns, some of which have thousands of characters of text in there, yes, you're going to run into problems with performance for sure. Then Power Query logic. So if your background jobs are running really slowly, you'd be looking for those, things like multiple merges, which might be making your transformation logic really complicated. You might be looking at large numbers of queries, maybe 70, 80, 90 queries within a single data flow or semantic model. You might be seeing people create visualizations, which are just big wide tables designed for data export. Those always seem to lead to performance problems. And you may have trained your users to use Excel and connect via the XMLA endpoint, but not warn them about what to do and what not to do in those situations. So those best practices need to be thought about, and I would always put a structured approach into an organization to making sure that people are thinking about these things. So you have a peer review process where team members who understand those best practices review each other's work and see if they can optimize things a little bit and avoid some of the things I've shown on the previous slide. You would look at making sure there's appropriate documentation, get some testing in place. Just a few weeks ago, we did a stress test of a new semantic model that was being built, and we had sort of 6 or 7 people all bashing that semantic model and running reports all at the same time on our less critical capacity. We saw the impact that it was having. We made a simple change to the model, and then we repeated the stress test and we made it 10 times faster. So that's the kind of thing you can put in place to make sure that you don't allow dangerous content onto your capacity too quickly. And obviously you can support all that with deployment pipelines and make sure that you're making mistakes in development environments where only a few users are working, rather than making mistakes where lots of people can then run the report and magnify that mistake, make it worse. So the other thing you can do is just look at the list of Power BI premium features, for example, and Fabric features, and figure out whether your artifact that's causing you a problem actually needs to be on the capacity at all. Perhaps it can be moved onto shared capacity, taken off the Fabric capacity and put back into a pro workspace. And that can create some headroom. So often you can go into an organization and find that 25% of what's in a Fabric capacity could just be sat on a pro capacity without you paying specifically for it at all. So let me pause there before moving on to the last topic and just see what we are getting in terms of questions. Could real-time analytics, yeah, let's have a look. Could real-time analytics be an option to set up live monitoring on the capacity? Would that be the same as using the default app? I don't know. I haven't investigated that at all. I'd love to see it a bit more real time, because actually the app is usually a little bit behind real life. So it would be great. Microsoft, I think, do keep the data set that supports all this to themselves to some extent. You can't go in and see any of the DAX or anything like that. So I don't know whether that would be possible, whether we have enough access as admins to do that or not. Can the auto scaling be done the same way like vertical scaling in Azure? Srinivasan, I'm afraid I don't know anything about vertical scaling in Azure, so I'm finding it hard to answer that question. Apologies. Okay, Nadim, I'm reading that, but it's just a comment rather than a question. If you want to add any more, let me know. How to create close to real-time alerts on capacity metrics with or without Fabric items. No, not really. I don't think there's no way that I know of, Jagger. It is what it is. You set up those alerts that I've shown you in the capacity settings, and then you run the report and refresh it on a regular basis. One thing I'm just going to say, the report itself, this is a very basic thing I'm about to say, but I quite often find that it caches. So I see the data I see is not completely up to date. So I often come in here, just hold the control button and refresh the page to make sure it doesn't use the cache at all. And often then I see the latest information. I know that's very basic and all of you will know that, but just to make sure. Yeah, the app is just a Power BI report. Agreed. Using data activator. Good question. I don't have the answer to that one. I like the idea. Maybe I can add it to a future presentation, Jagger. Okay, so let me just finish up the last section before we run out of time. So for those of you that do have multiple capacities or are considering multiple capacities, I wanted to just give you a real life example of where that's applied. So the organization I'm talking about here had two capacities. One was P1 sized, which is F64, and the other one was P2 sized, which was F128. And you can see it had the original one was created, had been around for a few years and had grown significantly over time. It had a range of different things on it: data flows, models, reports, critical HR content, critical business performance information. It had a mix of dev, test, UAT, production, but it was always up at the 80% mark and regularly spiking over 100 as well. And then a newer capacity had been put in place through a large program that had happened. And it had a lot of workspaces, but it was all very new content that wasn't really being used to anything like the same degree. And again, it also had dev, test, UAT, and production, but it was down at 30 to 45%. Now, as a Power BI admin, I could see quite quickly that we didn't need to buy any more capacity for this organization. If anything, there's way too much stuff in that organization, and it needs a lot of optimization, and it definitely doesn't need more budget. It needs to be managed, basically. And so unfortunately, before we could get a grip on it, there were some severe breaches in January this year that impacted the chief exec and other leaders. Two of those issues actually were down to a Microsoft problem that I described earlier on, an issue with data flows Gen 1. And then we had basically a long running data flow where the volumes of data had unexpectedly changed. And we also had a paginated report that was meant to filter down to one organization, one customer effectively, before it would run. The filtering stopped working and it was trying to return all the customers, and it went from being a 20-page paginated report to like 140,000 page paginated report. So that caused a massive performance problem, obviously. And the P1 capacity, the self-service one, was regularly going over that 100%, but in a fairly minor way. But these three severe issues led us to really move and change things quickly. So we did some analysis looking at the average CU usage across both the capacities, and we could see that actually we had sufficient capacity, but we needed to reallocate things around to increase our resilience, robustness. And we put a strategy together that had these principles basically. So highest priority given to interactive operations, so the ability to actually run reports. We would categorize reporting as critical or non-critical and treat it differently. We would deprioritize dev, test, and UAT. We would stop refreshes on dev, test, and UAT routinely. They would only be ad hoc in nature. We would look for scheduled refreshes and stop them on dev, test, and UAT. And we would make sure that as much as possible got moved off the capacities and back into shared capacity where we could. So those were our principles. And we reviewed all the content across all the capacities and categorized them as production and non-production, critical, non-critical. We worked out which workspaces were doing primarily foreground activities and which workspaces were doing primarily background activities. And the reason we did that is because we wanted to have a reasonable split of background activity, to make sure that neither of the capacities was kind of being wholly used up by background activity and had no room for foreground activities at all. So then we assigned each workspace to a capacity, and we moved 10% of the workspaces off capacities entirely. The critical capacity picked up production critical foreground activities primarily, so interactive reporting stuff from production, for critical functions. It picked up important background activities up to the point where it was being used 35 to 40% at any given time, to give that sort of 55 to 65% capacity for spikes in the foreground content. And then the non-critical got all the non-production stuff, anything that was production but not critical, and it picked up all the other background activity basically. And we gave the critical capacity the higher unit, the higher SKU. We enabled Autoscale to make it completely resilient. So even in the rare occasions where it did get to 100%, it would kick in Autoscale and the end users wouldn't be impacted at all. Going back to our principle here, interactive operations could not be affected anymore. We used PowerShell scripts to actually move content from one place to another. It was actually very quick and easy to do. We haven't had any throttling in the 7 months since that. We've had 3 instances of Autoscale kick in, but all less than 24 hours. We've had a couple of instances of throttling on non-critical, but very brief, with minimal business impact. And we see the critical capacity running on sort of 40% all the time, with peaks of 70 when things are really busy. And non-critical gets only up to 75. So we feel like we have it much more under control now, and having multiple capacities has really enabled us to do that. So key takeaways, just to wrap up the session then. So do monitor proactively, get those alerts in place, run that report on a regular basis. Make sure that people understand what can cause problems in their artifacts, whether it's Fabric items or formal Power BI items as well. Drive home those best practices, put processes in to review content before it goes live. Put a checklist in place so that you're not the only person that can go and keep an eye on the capacity. And if you do have multiple capacities or have the option to have multiple capacities, I would always have multiple capacities instead of one big capacity, because it enables you to be a bit more flexible and strategize in the way that we did at my customer. Okay, so I've tried to answer questions throughout. I realize we're out of time. So I only think I've missed one question, which is, can data be shared across different capacities? I don't quite understand the question, but you can certainly have semantic models or lake houses on one capacity and then other things on another capacity. So I think the answer to that is yes, but I'm not sure I fully get the question. Does anyone have any last questions before I wrap up? I'm realizing I'm out of my time. Well, thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to speaking to you again somewhere else. Take care.